Welcome to the Startup Field Guide, where we learn from successful founders of unicorn startups how their companies found product market fit. I'm your host, Sandhya Hegde, and today we'll be diving into the story of Harness, a CI/CD company which helps large engineering organizations embrace continuous delivery. Last valued at $3.7 billion in a 2022 fundraise, Harness was founded by serial entrepreneur and Unusual Ventures co-founder Jyoti Bansal. Jyoti, please say hello.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here, Sandhya.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have two important pieces of context for today's episode. Jyoti's first startup, AppDynamics, was a market leader in the APM category, also known as Application Performance Management. It was famously acquired by Cisco the night before their IPO, also for $3.7 billion. Jyoti co-founded Unusual Ventures with my partner, John Riones, who's co-hosting this podcast with me today. John and Jyoti have known each other for a long time, and Jyoti was actually just thinking about starting AppDynamics when they first met. John, please say hello.
Hello, and it's nice to be here with both you and Jyoti. You know, we've known each other almost 15 years now, back when Jyoti was just thinking about starting AppDynamics when we met. So it's exciting to talk about Harness.
So Jyoti used Harness in 2017, which I think was just a couple of months after Cisco acquired AppDynamics. What was the original insight behind Harness?
Well, the original insight behind Harness was that everyone was struggling with DevOps and CI/CD and software delivery. I saw that firsthand at AppDynamics. We had about 400 engineers at that time. When we sold the company to Cisco, and for every 10 to 12 engineers, there was one person whose job was to take care of deployment scripting, deployment tooling, babysit deployments, troubleshoot deployments, etc. And if you just do the math, that was about like 30 or so engineers who were spending their time doing that kind of work. 30 engineers is like $5 to $6 million a year. And I'll just do the math as we're spending $5 to $6 million a year doing this stuff, which is kind of like toil kind of work. And even then, we are not very good at doing it. So that's a problem. And then all of AppDynamics customers, I would hear the same story, but at a much larger scale, because these were like banks and retailers, and these are banks with like 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 software engineers working for them. And If you look at the magnitude of this, so to me, it's like we gotta solve this thing. That we have to build a solution to solve the problem around DevOps, CI/CD, make it streamlined. Everyone in the world needs DevOps. Everyone needs CI/CD. No one likes the current approaches. Everyone hates it. Everyone is struggling. So there is an opportunity, to solve this. That's kind of the high level insight I started with. When you start with the insight like that, now it's like the hard work starts on how do you convert that into a product market fit. What is
Right.
how do you do that? And as you know, at Unusual, that's a core focus of we look at like can we convert that into a playbook? Can we take those insights, like a high level insight, into a market opportunity into a playbook to convert it to a product market fit?
Yeah, I can say that working with Jyoti all these years, I've now seen him do it 3 times. But going back to the AppDynamics days and then Harness, I watched him essentially put together a playbook of sorts to go from insight to product market fit. So, really the basis of Unusual was combining his experiences and the hundreds of companies that, I've had the privilege of working with over the last 20 years, and really trying to, provide something to founders that we felt didn't exist, which was this set of steps to go through when you have an insight, but you're trying to build a company and ultimately find product market fit. So we landed on the term, the Unusual method, which is our approach. And you can see it in our field guide. You can see it in our Founder Academy, which Jyoti and I are currently teaching at the moment. You can see it in our engagement model. And I'm really excited today to talk about the specifics of how Harness and Jyoti sort of did that process the second time.
And Jyoti, now that you have been through this multiple times, like what would have been your ideal experience when you first started AppDynamics? Like, are you now teaching what would have been useful to you in the past?
Yeah, I wish I had a playbook at that time. Like, as when I started AppDynamics, you really have no idea, what you have. I had an insight for AppDynamics that people are building these complex distributed applications, and something goes wrong in it, you can't easily troubleshoot and fix it. So that was the insight, but converting that insight to a product market fit that you can go and build a scalable business around. There was really no playbook, and if there was a playbook and a formula and some approach, I would have definitely gladly would love to take that on.
So Jody, I want to ask you about the early days of Harness and some of the assumptions that you were testing. We talk about this in the Unusual Method as the customer discovery phase. And we highlight the importance of figuring out your user and buyer and how to describe the pain and even go about the messaging framework and the approach. I think one of the things that people might be very surprised to hear is how you did cold outreach, how you were testing your initial hypotheses about what Harness solved, who it solved it for, who was desperate, as we talk about. So I was wondering if you could walk us through some of your customer discovery process early on at Harness.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that many times as founders, you end up talking to people your friends, family, people
Right.
who are working in similar kind of roles in other companies. It could be very misleading. So that's the one thing I've learned the hard way from my AppDynamics days. That's where not having a playbook really hurt there. In AppDynamics, I was introduced to these friendly customers and accounts, and we would spend a lot of time talking to them. So yeah, we kind of like what you're doing, but
They
nothing
want to be
will.
nice to you.
Yes, because they all want to nice to you, because they are friendly and they don't want to say like you're a founder with a lot of excitement about like what you want to solve, and they want to be nice to your face. The problem is that nice is very bad for you, because now you're not getting the blunt feedback. So to convert to you have to convert to revenue. Like most people will end up building a product that now is not sellable easily, because you didn't hear the blunt feedback around what's working, what's not working, etc. So I'm a strong believer in like you have to do cold outreach. Cold outreach is the best way to to prove it out that it's going to work or not. Like if people are not even taking your call, you reach out people cold about the problem. That means that problem is not really interesting enough for a lot of people. That's a validation of your assumptions right there. But when they take your call, can does the pain resonate? Does your solution resonate? Does urgency resonate? Those conversations are much important to do with someone who's not your friend, who's not who's not in your network. And when and we talk about it in the unusual method and the discovery phase, the things that you really need to figure out is the pain, which is it's really we call it the 3 why kind of framework, like why buy anything, which is the pain of is the pain there, like for someone to buy anything. Why buy now is the urgency there for them to solve the pain today. And then do we have the why buy from you, like does your solution have the differentiation enough for people to buy from you, right? So it's and those are the ones you have to validate. I wish many times people think like hey, you're a repeat entrepreneur, you have done build multiple products, so you won't make mistakes on your assumptions on product market fit. That is the biggest I would say it's I wish it was true, but that's not the case. Like and every time I build the product, you still have wrong assumptions. And the only way you get out of your wrong assumptions is being very rigorous about that phase of having these kind of cold hard conversations with many people.
And it sounds like you are very methodical about defining kind of your assumptions. So, like for Harness, could you walk us through how did you think about like, okay, customer, who's a user, who's a buyer, like how do you think about cold outreach, like making it really efficient, engaging? Would love to hear some stories from your early days at Harness.
Well, one of the things that and we talk about that at Unusual, in the academy as well. Is like you have to start with like wide. You go wide and then you go narrow. Like because initially you want to make sure like you talk to customers in large enterprise and mid-size and small companies. You maybe talk to multiple personas as well on the user side, the buyer side, and before assuming everything, you obviously will have thesis around something, but you want to validate that. But then you want to start narrowing it down eventually to who's your initial buyer, who's your initial user, where is your ICP, the ideal customer profile would be, what kind of companies, and that's you want to be as methodical about it, to starting from that point. What you want to see is, where is the pain resonating the most, like and that's actually, I would say the simpler one to figure out. The one that is harder after that is the urgency. Like where is the most urgency? Like where people want to solve their pain right now. Because that's where your initial money will come in. Like, it's as a startup, you have to survive by driving initial revenue. And if you can't figure out urgency, you're not going to have initial revenue quickly. Right. So that's a lot of that comes from these kind of the methodical conversation around what is urgency right now in these organizations. Right. So in Harness case, for example, we started with like people are struggling with all these kind of DevOps challenges. And we will go to these companies and say, like, we can solve your problems much better. You can, instead of doing manual scripting and building this manual pipelines to do your deployments, you can have an automated process that can do your deployments right away. The pain was real. People would, yep, we spend this much time and energy. We have this many engineers working on it. It's kind of, our pipelines are broken. We can't do deployments reliably, all sort of things. But the urgency wasn't really there in many of those because they had something that was there. So what we found through that process, that the urgency was new projects, like people moving to Kubernetes or people moving an application to a new cloud native architecture. So we definitely changed our messaging and our initial product market fit around that as well. Our initial assumption, like when I was at AppDynamics, at that time we are mostly selling to very large organizations. So a lot of the conversations that I was hearing was very large companies. My co-founder at Harness, he came from Apple, which was kind of a very large company as well, where he was seeing some of these pain problems over there. But the problem in many of these companies that we were talking to, and even companies like Apple, like they didn't really have the urgency to change it right away, like to buy from a startup something new. So the urgency for us was when people were starting a new project or doing a new architecture, moving to re-architecting their applications to move to Kubernetes, or re-architecting their apps to move to the cloud, or building a brand new app. But we initially started with the assumption that these companies have so much pain, we can sell it there, but we had to adjust it to where the urgency would be.
And for your ICP, how did you think about like the Silicon Valley bubble of like tech company customers versus going outside it? Like, is the process you use for reaching them different? How do you think about those two kind of buyer personas?
I would say, it's better to go wide and then go narrow. It's like, there is no point only talking to Silicon Valley companies, because you could be in that bubble. Where your market is, defines who you talk to. Like, in Harness case, the long-term market is not just Silicon Valley. Like, you have 35 million software developers in the world. Out of those 35 million software developers, you only have I don't know, a million or two at most in Silicon Valley, maybe not even that. So the majority of the market is outside of that. So if you find a product market fit that only suits, some of the companies in Silicon Valley and no one else, that's a problem. But the core is to find the sort of the early adopter thought leader kind of companies though. Like, you don't want to build your initial, first product market fit for the laggards kind of companies. So, and sometimes people assume that the thought leaders are only in Silicon Valley. That's not true, right? You have if you are looking at, selling into a broader market, you have to identify, like, who are the smart thought leading kind of teams and companies and people, across across the country, or maybe even wider than the country. And then you try to have the conversation and build the product that could be more widely acceptable to that audience.
Jody, just to play that back for a second, you emphasize the importance of having these cold conversations, not benefiting, certainly in your case, from the AppDynamics success, even as you built Harness. And I think for a lot of first-time founders, that's a painful experience to reach out to a bunch of people, not even get a response in a lot of cases, or if they do get a response, to be told, hey, I'm not interested, or that's just not exciting. So can you share a little bit more about that, your specific outreach technique, and how you thought about rejection and maybe iteration as a result?
It's a good question. Like, as a first-time founder, when you become, especially when you come from engineering and product background, you normally don't have sales experience. I didn't have any sales experience when I did at AppDynamics. And rejections are hard. Like, if you're not used to selling and you'd reach out to someone and say, no, we don't really want it, or we don't really care, or they don't even respond. It's hard the first time you do it. But I do think that's very important for any founder to learn that. And it's very important for founders to learn some selling. Like, there is no way you can build a company if you don't try to develop that part of your your skill set of like how to sell. And a big part of selling is figuring out, like, reaching out to a lot of people, identifying, qualifying who the right, where the right audience is for your pain is, articulating the pain, your solution, and then getting them in the process. So I'm a strong believer just from a outreach tooling perspective, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is such a powerful tool available for for any startup these days. You can search and find the right industries, the right personas. It doesn't take too much effort to reach out to people on LinkedIn. But you will have rejection. Like if you reach out to 100 people, you you're ideally gonna get maybe at most like 8 to 10 conversations. But those 8 to 10 conversations are quite good. It's the and out of those 8 or 10 conversations, you will convert some of them into the where these are your ideal customers, where the right pain, and over time, once you do those conversations like maybe 30, 50 times, you can start narrowing it down, where your success rate gets higher, because for this particular industry, for this particular persona, the pain is high. So like in harness case, for example, right? Once we initially were going very wide, but then we figure out the where we get the most response and the pain is pretty acute is people deploying on Kubernetes in kind of some mid-sized to large-sized companies, where there's the people the big projects going on, but they're all the current pipelines or the CI/CD tooling that they've built out, especially on the deployment tooling, doesn't really work well on the in the modern Kubernetes environments. They are all figuring out, okay, how do I go and deploy in these environments? So once we kind of narrowed it down, then we will go and search for on LinkedIn, who are these companies who are doing large Kubernetes projects. And if you reach out to them, your success rate is higher, right? So initially the success rate is lower because you're more wider. Once you narrow it down, you can get better. But I encourage every founder, use LinkedIn, reach out to people, and many times, do it yourself, because doing it, not just rely on that I need a salesperson to do this thing. At least in the beginning, it's better for founders to do it, because they need to also see what roles are there, what personas are there, what industries are there. Just doing the search on LinkedIn gives you a lot of insights, and reaching out to people and figuring out like which one, who are responding, who are not responding. It's very important. I strongly encourage all founders that they have to be on the calls. That if you don't do the calls, and you don't have to do every call, but you have to do a large number of calls in the beginning. Otherwise, getting the product market fit, it will be at pretty high risk.
I've heard you say that talking to friendlies or warm introductions, it can be more misleading than talking to cold outreach connections, because it doesn't feel good to tell people no, or to tell especially people you have a common connection with. The second thing I've heard you actually tell founders is that when they do talk to people and they ask essentially why buy now, prospects don't always give you clear answers. So I'm curious, in the case of Harness, what were you looking for when you talked to a customer prospect that gave you a signal that they were serious about why buy now? Did they have an alternative? Were they hacking something together already? Like, how did you know that there was a yes to that question versus a maybe or a no, in which case you would be wasting your time?
Yeah, I think that's you have to ask the right kind of questions there. Like, to me, the important question is to ask is what kind of initiatives they have going on right now. Like, they have KPIs around it, they have MBOs around it, they have OKRs around it. If they, let's say someone is talking about we are re-architecting to move to to Kubernetes, and so the first thing I'll ask is okay, what is the timeline? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? And then do you need to have the automated deployment pipelines in Harness case when you do that launch of that say the new project, new architecture? And if the answer is yes, in 6 months we want to move here, or the phase one of our re-architecture has to happen in 6 months, our OKRs are tied to it, and to achieve that we need automated deployment pipelines, then that there is the why now urgency there. If someone says very broadly yeah, we have vague things around that, which is that we don't have a clear timeline, there's really these are not in the yes, what we're talking about seems exciting, important, but we don't really have a project going on, or something that ties to some initiative or some project or some initiative, then the why buy now is less. The second part is very important also, is understanding the business case for them, right? It's the people can have urgency, but if the business value of what you're providing is not clear, it would not convert to business for you, right? So my favorite question to ask in many of these conversations is how would you make the business case to your boss? So of like say if you have to ask your boss, hey, I want to bring this product harness into into the company and we want to spend some money for it. Uh, what would you tell your boss? Like so, ideally, you want to hear from the person you're talking to. Normally, would be like a your some sort of a technical champion in this case, right? So you want them to talk about like yes, the case I will make is that we are every time we do a deployment, we have 5 engineers on the call, babysitting the deployment, and that's costing us this much money on the engineering time. Or we have like our deployments fail 20% of the time, and troubleshooting the deployments have it takes time and it impacts our customer satisfaction in some quantifiable way. Or that we cannot go and even finish this project unless we have automated deployment pipelines built out here. So it's like it's there is no way we can meet the deadlines of finishing this project unless we have that, right? So they like how you would articulate the business value and the case to your boss, and if they don't have a clear clarity on how would they talk about it, most likely when they go higher up and ask for the money to their boss, CFO, whoever, they will be rejected and down there, right? So you have to understand that as well in any of those conversations.
Can you give our founders who are listening a sense of how many iterations you did on your pitch deck and how many meetings you had? Because we rarely meet a founding team who doesn't think they've had enough conversations. A lot of people think they've done this work, but in reality, they probably haven't. And so how did you know when to move on and start working more closely with design partners? And then, how much iteration did you actually do ahead of time? Because I think that usually surprises people as well.
Yeah. Well, it is a lot of work. My rule of thumb is about 50, that you have to do about 50 conversations to really get it right. And you start with like, let's say your first pitch deck or whatever it is that demo story pitch deck that you start with. And after like initially after every 3 or 4 conversations, or maybe even sooner, you will be okay, this doesn't work, it didn't resonate, let's try changing something, and you change it to something else, and then you do it again after another 3 or 4, and then you start learning and you do it again, and you're also honing in the persona and the user buyer and the ICP at that time, right? By the time you normally get to like 30, 35, you start getting like ideal state should be that you're not hearing anything new now. Like it's the same kind of pain that you heard multiple times, and how you are talking about it is how what you're hearing. The same kind of urgency that you figured out, like how to talk about it and how customers are talking about it, the business value, the solution, like how you articulate the differentiation in your solution, and how people are perceiving. So it takes about 5-6 iterations at least for that. Like so every 3, 4, 5. In my case, when we were doing it for Harness, like we'll do these calls with customers. After every call, we'll do like okay, what worked, what didn't work in that call, and do we need to change our message? Do we need to change our positioning, how we talk about it? How even the product roadmap should, if we talk about that based on those conversations, and then we'll try that out in the next 3 or 4 or 5, and then we'll change it again and we'll try it out. And by about 30, 35, you start hearing the same things. And then you can slow it down. You can still have like another 10, 15 if you want at that point. And if you're still not hearing the same things, you don't have a consistency of those, of the personas and the ICP and your messaging at that time, you still haven't really figured out the foundation of your product market fit. And it's kind of a waste of time to build out the product without getting that. So you want to make sure, you're doing more and more of that.
Brilliant. I mean, it's like simple but so effective. I think the 2 really big takeaways here are, one, like in the early days, it is brute force. Like you have to do the outreach, you have to iterate on the deck. There's no secret sauce, there's no magic bullet. You have to put in the work. And 2, like I think the beauty of the asking the right questions is so clear. You're not asking them, would you like to ship faster? Because everyone would say yes. That is actually the easiest way to poorly validate your idea. Yeah, I love that. I think, so what I'm hearing you say is, once you start hearing the same things, like your deck is now stable, you can start thinking about, okay, what is the minimum viable product? So I'm curious, what's been your approach to MVP? Do you think it's more or less the same? Has it evolved a lot, between building App Dynamics versus now Harness?
Yeah, MVP is an interesting question always. It depends on are you creating a new market or you're going into an existing kind of market, right? If you're going in an existing kind of market, your MVP many times product managers obsessed with MVP. It's like, oh, this is the thing we can ship with, and someone can start using it. And which is the minimum definition, the minimum viable, that you can have these three features and you still have some viable product that someone can use it. I like to think of it slightly different. At Harness, we call it minimum sellable product. Like, what is your minimum sellable product? And, if you're going into an existing market, minimum sellable product bar is a bit higher, right? If you have to replace some incumbent, or, someone is evaluating against you against some incumbent, you have to, at least do the core capabilities that the incumbent will do. Like, say the incumbent have 20, core features, and out of 20, like say, 10 are like bells and whistles that many people don't need, but there are 10 that are very core out of those, right? So then those 10 you have to have in your MVP, right? So what at Harness, when we build new products, we started with our CD product, and now we have 8 products. So we go through the same cycle in each of our products that we build. What we call it, like, if you're going in an existing market, you look at, like, what are the table stake features which are really coming from what the incumbents would have and what you need to address an incumbent. And then what are your core, your major differentiating capabilities on it, right? If you don't have major differentiation, that's a challenge as well. But many times, if you only do the differentiation, it's not going to work, because for someone to pay pay for your product compared to an incumbent, they need the table stake things as well, right? So to me, the MVP has to be has to be defined with that in mind. So that's why I don't even like to use the word MVP. At Harness, we call it the minimum sellable product, because it's clear, like, what can we sell versus not.
In how many early design partners, that's what we call them in the Unusual Method, did you work with to go from kind of initial instantiation of Harness to something that was the minimum sellable product? And did you have a time frame in mind when you started it? And did the time frame line up with reality?
No, I don't think it ever does. The time frame, you start with by shooting for 6 months, 9. We understand what to build it now. Like, let's work with, normally like 3 to 5 design partners are a good number. More is like, maybe the most you can handle is like 5 to 7. Beyond that becomes too much to handle. And we thought in 6 months, 9 months we can ship something and be in a good product. But that it takes time. Like, when you start releasing it out, let's say when we launched the first version of our product, like, what we thought, even with working with the design partners, would be our right V1 minimum sellable product. It had major gaps. Like, we launched it and people were like, we built this beautiful UI, because some of our design partners all wanted a beautiful UI. And then we started selling it, like, it figured out, like, for people to really adopt it, they actually need automation through almost like what people call like pipelines as code. Like, you write your pipelines as code into these YAML files and do automation, because otherwise it doesn't scale. Like, you can't really get, like, hundreds or thousands of developers to come in and onboard quickly, right? So we had to, like, almost change even after we did that, which is that, okay, let's make that as the more first class element of how people use our product, because when people start adopting something, it could be different set of requirements and different that you didn't think about as carefully before, right? So there is that element, like, when people so you're showing the product, you hear the feedback and the design feedback from the prospects you're working with. But when they start using the product, it can change, right? So that's that, and then you have to adjust your product into it, like, because then they may realize, okay, using it has these challenges or these gaps, and you have to be very nimble and iterative about that as well.
So during that implementation phase, I would imagine you ran into a few surprises. Is that something that you'd recommend founders think about in terms of their time frame and being open-minded about the surprises?
There will always be surprises. That's what. But you want to reduce the surprises is the main thing. Like, the more conversations you do, and the more you get the product in hands of people kind of earlier, you reduce the surprises there. Like, there are two kind of surprises, right? There's the technical surprises, like, the product won't work because of whatever things, like, your product requires some kind of installation, and in practice that installation customers won't do it. Like, on paper it sounded right, but they won't do it right now, like, or something like that. So that's those something you will the sooner you can remove those surprises by asking people to install. Like, if you have an alpha product, if you can get even the basics of it installed by some people, you can get rid of those surprises, or install or getting going some things, right? So you can do it right. The second set of surprises, which could be even harder, are the business value surprises. Like, you build the whole thing out, and you're trying to sell it at some point. Okay, now the design partner phase is over. Pay us some money now, and people are okay. It's this is all good. Like, you work with someone for 6 months, and now they still don't really have the business case for to justify the money for it. That's a big surprise as well. Then you probably build the wrong product, or like, you have gaps in the business value side of it. So I would say, like, you have to keep asking that question as well. Like, okay, if what we are building, if we do this, do we have the business case to pay for it or not? And because that creates an honesty. Like, you don't want to be surprised on that you build a product that people are not going to buy in that.
Maybe it's a good segue to the problem of like market environment changing the priorities that a company might have, which means that like you thought you had business value, but maybe their circumstances have changed. How are you thinking about the environment we are in right now, where there are a lot of headwinds, but they are very unique, and there's low unemployment, and but we are still expecting a recession. Like, how are you thinking about how the company Harness should plan in terms of growth goals and all of those, and how are you evaluating this recession for a software company?
Yeah, obviously, officially we are not in recession yet, I think, but we
Right.
will be soon. Everyone thinks we will be soon, and I do think we will be soon as well. Every company has to plan for it. Like, there's uh, we can't, as the world for tech startups have changed. Like, if you're early stage startup, your point about the assumptions that you made on the web business value have changed. Like, like a year ago, maybe your assumptions were about, we can create more velocity for you, that you can ship some things faster. But in the current economy, many of the people who wanted to focus on that velocity may not want to focus on velocity right now. They may really care about efficiency. So your business value prioritization changes.
Right.
The one thing that is very clear that we are seeing at Harness, and every company seeing, is that almost every deal has to be approved by CFO right now. Like, so no one in most companies, people are not buying without a financial team approving something. So now it's like, is your business value justifiable to the CFO? Which a year ago or 18 months ago, CFOs were not involved in, like, like most of the transactions. Like, people will have their budgets. If you're operating in your budget, you can go and buy things. You don't have to get an approval for everything from your CFO. So things change in this kind of market. So as startups, you have to be nimble, right? If you're early stage startup, you have to think about your business value. If you're a late stage startup, you also have to think about your business value. And I do think efficiency is a core driver in a lot of the value that's happening. That's how we look at Harness as well. Like, our a lot of our we are fortunate that our value pitch was always built around efficiency. That, like, that how many engineers it takes for you to do this kind of fast deployments, and by not having those, how much developer toil is happening. That your developers are wasting like 10%, 20% of their time doing this kind of stuff that could be automated through the right kind of automation. What's the cost for your 10%, 20% developer time for your developers? So, but you have to become even better and better at making that case. Like, that what you're investing in is going to save you money, right? And that's current environment is important. On the operating the business side, like, every founder right now, every CEO right now is thinking about, okay, what is uh, the right balance of growth versus runway versus efficiency. And I do think everyone should be, the if you look at it, like, the stock market for high growth tech companies and all was corrected 50, 60, 70%. So, many times people think that is a proxy for how much is the sales demand for products that the tech startups are selling has changed, which is not true. Like, there is impact of economy and recession, but the impact is like 10, 15%. It's not like 50, 70, 80% what we have in the stock market. So the stock market hasn't completely changed, like, so the how much impact it is there from the sales side, but there is some impact. The primary impact is the scrutiny. Like, that when you're selling something, you have to be ready for more scrutiny from the CFOs, better scrutiny of your business case, and your sales process is to make sure that is happening. So you have to, as CEO, you have to bring that in, and with that, we are bringing that in Harness. Much better scrutiny, much tighter sales process, so that we can do that. When you plan for your how much you grow versus not, I do think the access to capital and where the uncertainty around capital is definitely there. There is a lot of as all all of us in the VC world know, there's a lot of dry powder, but still people are in the wait and watch in many cases, especially when it comes to the later stage companies. Early stage, the investing is still almost about the same. So as a company, you have to plan for that, right? So I really encourage everyone, closer to a 2-year runway is good. So plan for that. Like everyone wants efficient growth right now. If your growth is inefficient, and and because of that you need cash, and in less than a year or so, it could be a tough spot, right? So you have to design for efficient growth and extend the runway to closer to 2 years in this market.
Jody, that's a great way to close the segment, because we see a lot of startups out there who aren't able to grow efficiently. And that efficiency, it goes all the way back to the customer discovery process that you're describing, that you followed at Harness, right? If you never figure out how to reach cold customers and identify the why buy now, the why buy anything, and you didn't build the right product, you took the elevator and not the stairs, then it ends up showing up in your efficiency later on. And now, where the cost of capital is so much higher, you're seeing investors turn away from those companies. And so, just bringing it full circle, it's obviously Harness has done extremely well, found product market fit, and is scaling very efficiently. And I think it's really important that our listeners understand that's all the way back to the early hard work that you did.
I 100% agree. That's why it's so important. Sometimes you see companies where they got to the first million of revenue fast, and then they can't figure out how to scale from there because you didn't really get the product market fit exercise properly. So the product market fit you thought it was there, but it was kind of fake. And a lot of times I see companies kind of getting into that fake product market fit, that you think you have it because you brute force into some friendly conversations and friendly customers, or 1 or 2 concentrated customers, and you don't really have a true scalable product market fit. And that, but if you build the right, do this right product market fit exercise, you're building the right foundation, you can scale on it. The only thing I would do say that though is you have to keep doing it. You cannot, because the product market fit you found, at some point that will change in 3 years, because markets will change and markets will evolve and competitive landscape will change and technology trends will change. So you have to constantly every few years you have to keep going through. Okay, let's find your true product market fit again exercise, and that if you have the true product market fit at any point of time, you can build an efficient growth model, and that's why it's so key to get that right.
Amazing chat. Thank you so much, Jyoti, for hanging out with us today, and John for co-hosting with me. And that's a wrap.
Well, this is easy, hanging out with my favorite people.
Thanks, Sandhya. Thanks, Jyoti.
You've been listening to the Startup Field Guide with Sandhya, an Unusual Ventures podcast. Stay connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you liked what you heard, please rate our show and help us reach more aspiring founders with lessons on how to find product market fit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.